These are the books that I read in January, or at least the physical ones. I also read 2 ebooks and 2 audiobooks. A surprisingly strong start to the year, at least in terms of quantity, but was it very good in terms of quality? That's the question I'm hoping to answer in today's wrap-up video. Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel. So I read 11 books in total in January, and normally I'd review all of them in these wrap-ups, but I think that would make for a really long video. Instead, I noticed a little bit of a theme among some of the books that I picked up this month, and 4 of them were all addressing apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic scenarios. Given my reading challenge, the Read Good Challenge has a prompt for February for post-apocalyptic or pandemic-themed novels, I thought I'd take these 4 plus the one that I'm reading for the challenge, which is Lingmar's Severance, and wrap them up all together in a dedicated end of the world video. And if you're reading along with the challenge, it might give you a little bit of inspiration about what to turn to. That still leaves 7 books to review today, which is quite a few, and so I'm going to get straight into it. Starting with Eastbound by Maylis de Kerengal, translated from French by Jessica Moore. This is a short little novel that I intended to read on New Year's Day, as there was someone in the comments who mentioned reading an entire novella every 1st of January as a little bit of a tradition, and I really liked the sound of that and fully intended to do it. The bad news was that I was far too hungover on New Year's Day to read anything at all. Thank you to today's sponsor, Tequila. That's just a joke, by the way. But the good news was that I had booked off the 2nd of January, and so I did it then instead. This is a story about a young man named Alyosha, who is a Russian army conscript. He's being sent to a post out in the east of Russia somewhere, and so we join him on the Trans-Siberian Railway as he crosses the country. However, he does not want to be in the army, and so he resolves to escape somewhere along the way. Desertion is a very serious crime, and so the stakes are really high. And while attempting to make his getaway, he meets a French woman called Hélène, who is also on the train and making her own getaway of sorts from a relationship, and she somewhat reluctantly helps him out. I really liked how it had a very cramped and claustrophobic atmosphere, but at the same time that was very much in juxtaposition with the vast open space outside the train that was flying by the window. The tension at some points was absolutely off the charts, particularly towards the end, and it kept me riveted. And one interesting thing about this novel is that it kind of reads like, or rather feels like, a book that could have been written 50 or 100 years ago, or at least set then. And so for me, I was very surprised now and again when something modern like a mobile phone was mentioned. I would have said that the book could do with dispensing with those references to be truly ambiguous about when it was set, which might show like how things haven't changed or like much hasn't moved on in certain areas of life. But in the end, I do think the inclusion of some of the more modern things makes quite a bit of sense. Overall, I really enjoyed this one. Definitely a good exercise in atmosphere and tension. Next up, have you been accused of terrible behaviour in the workplace? Or perhaps you've decided that alt-right bell-end-in-chief Ben Shapiro is right about everything after all, and you've been loudly saying so on social media. If that has you worried about being cancelled, then fear not, because you can move to the Rubin Institute Plymouth, a paradise for the purged where you can treat women like shit and culturally appropriate to your heart's content. That's kind of the setup for How I Won a Nobel Prize by Julius Taranto. This is the debut novel from Taranto and follows an academic called Helen, who is sort of a physicist, sort of a computer scientist, and she's working for a renowned Nobel Prize winning physicist in search of high temperature superconductors. If you're wondering what the hell is a high temperature superconductor, indulge me for like 30 seconds to explain. Whenever we move energy from one place to another, say from a generator to your home or from a battery pack to an e-reader, it must pass through some sort of conductive material. Pretty much every material we use for this purpose creates friction as the electrons pass through, stealing some of that energy and letting it go as heat. Superconductors are materials that can let electrons pass through with very low friction, and so are way more efficient than typical wires. But we have only been able to observe superconductivity in materials that are at very low temperatures. The hypothesis is that if we can find a material that is superconductive at room temperature or like an Earth ambient temperature, then we can make all of our energy grids super efficient and basically solve all of Earth's energy issues. Do not worry, you don't need to know any of that to enjoy this novel, but I just work in the energy industry, and so I find it personally a little bit interesting. All you do need to know is that Helen and her boss are on the hunt for a breakthrough, and they're making really good progress. That is, until her boss is subject to a scandal for having an affair with a student. Luckily for him, there exists the Rubin Institute Plymouth, or RIP, home to the cancelled, and he moves there, offering Helen to come with him. Helen realises that she can't actually achieve much without their partnership, and that they're kind of academic magic together, and so she and her husband go. This is a quite morally challenging decision for them, as they consider themselves to be quite socially progressive people, her husband in particular, but their move is the starting point for this really fun but thought-provoking novel. I know humour varies from person to person, but I found this really funny. This sort of utopia-dystopia duality has been done before in books like David Eggers' The Circle, but I thought it was just excellently realised here. There was just the right amount of ostentatiousness, just the right amount of ridiculousness, and frequently it had me laughing one moment and then unsettled the next. I also enjoyed just how morally grey this book is. It would be very easy to write this as a straight takedown of populism and the right-wing, anti-PC, anti-woke nonsense that has completely poisoned political discourse. But it examines it with what I think is a pretty fair hand, and also challenges the more harmful side of moral puritanism and the condemnation of unpopular opinions. Helen is somewhat of an amoral character in a way. She is most interested in her work and whatever lets her progress, and the more time she spends on the island, the more she tries to make peace with it. She wonders what's the harm in working for awful people if she ends up enabling net zero. The debates between her and her husband are really interesting, they really get your grey matter working, and they get you thinking about and challenging your own beliefs. It has a very satisfying conclusion, and I just really enjoyed this. I was going to read it anyway, but luckily it had a snake on the cover as well, so it fit the Savage Reads prompts, which I'm doing for January, and you had to read a book with a snake on the cover. Thank you so much to Picador for sending an early copy of this, which comes out on the 15th of February in the UK. Next, I read The Storm We Made by Vanessa Chan. This is another debut novel, and one that I have to applaud the marketing team for, because I'd never heard of it, and then all of a sudden everyone seemed to be talking about it and reading it, and I just couldn't resist. I ended up listening to it on audio as it's included in my Spotify Premium membership, and I guess a kind of side note that I'm a little bit morally conflicted about Spotify's moves into audiobooks. On the one hand, it is a nice way to access more books, but on the other, I'm seeing mixed things about whether authors will actually benefit. It's not like there's suddenly a bigger pot of money for Spotify to draw on for royalties, and so I'm keeping an eye on how that plays out. Anyway, this is a novel about a Malaysian family in a city called Bintang, told across 4 perspectives and 2 timelines. That might sound like a lot, but it does actually do a very good job of keeping them all in check, and I never once got confused. The main character of this book is the mother of the family, Cecily, and it's her story that covers both the 1930s when Malaysia is occupied by the British and when she's recruited as a Japanese informant, and in the 1940s when the Japanese have taken control and her son goes missing. The other 3 perspectives are her 3 children, Abel, Jujube and Jasmine, and they are all set in the 1940s. This was a total page turner with a lot of twists and turns and secrets uncovered, and I did find myself flying through it quite quickly as I was invested in a story and really wanted to find out what was going to happen next. It was surprisingly brutal as well. There was quite a bit of violence, including sexual violence, which I didn't expect based on the cover and the blurb. There's also some really interesting stuff about swapping one colonizer for another, in this case the British for the Japanese, and it's definitely eye-opening to get a perspective of the impact of World War II outside of Europe. I don't think I appreciate sometimes the breadth of the impact of that war, and it's very easy to centre your focus on Europe. I think the writing was okay, but it did have a lot of first novel energy. I mean, that makes sense, it's a debut, but it's stuff like people letting out breaths they didn't know they were holding, which happened on more than one occasion, as well as some dodgy dialogue. One egregious example for me was some English characters which came across as complete caricatures, although I'm not sure if that was the writing or the performance of that dialogue in the audiobook. Some of the plot points towards the end were, to be honest, utterly ridiculous, with these strange turns of events or characters suddenly doing these absolutely wild, out of character things, and I do wish that had been dialed back a little bit. In the end, I liked this, but I didn't quite love it. I'm glad I read it, and it did have a lot of emotional resonance, so you might get the same. Next I read The Guest by Emma Cline. This is something of a buzzy book, one that people I consider to be quite cool have been reading and loving. For some reason though, I thought I wouldn't like it. I've seen criticisms of Cline's writing being a bit pretentious and vapid, and so I've ended up steering clear until now. But let me tell you, I was completely wrong, because this was really good and I enjoyed it quite a lot. This is the story of Alex, a young woman and New York escort who is something of a chancer, a grifter. She's unafraid to take advantage of the men she solicits. We join her at a moment of relative stability though, where she's summering in the Hamptons with this rich guy called Simon that she's been seeing, who doesn't really know about her line of work. But that falls apart a little bit when they have a disagreement and he asks her to leave, to go back to the city. She decides not to actually leave the Hamptons, believing that if she can just hang around until Simon's famous Labour Day party that he throws at his house, all will be forgiven and things will be set right. And so we follow Alex for a week as she grifts her way around the Hamptons, meeting and manipulating a wide variety of people, often to the point of her getting the chance to swim in their pools. hence the UK cover. She herself is a little bit like the water in these pools, able to change shape and fill the space no matter the situation. I enjoyed the vibe of this one, the general sense of ennui and the slide into self-destruction. It's another book brimming with tension as Alex gets herself into these tricky situations and then has to talk and manipulate herself out of them, or, as often happens, deeper into them. It often made me laugh, but it was also desperately sad and frequently uncomfortable. For instance, there's one encounter where she befriends this child and pretends to be a family friend in order to work her way into a beach club, and there's something just so icky about it, but also really compelling. Overall, that tragicomic sensibility and that sense of foreboding that was threaded through the book was a real tonal sweet spot for me. Since I finished the book, I've actually seen quite a lot of discourse and speculation about the ending, lots of it completely wild, but I don't know what it says about me as a reader that I just accepted it for what it was. I guess I've just made peace with an ambiguous ending for now. But yeah, overall, really enjoyed this one, would highly recommend it. Then I read Good Material by Dolly Alderton. I have long been, for one reason or another, a Dolly doubter, a Dolly denier, maybe a Dolly dodger. But whatever the right term is, I have not been inclined to read anything by Dolly Alderton. I think partly because the marketing makes her stuff out to seem quite light and fluffy and not really the sort of thing that I look for. But I heard some good stuff about this one on Instagram, and it was another one that I found on Spotify, so I decided to give it a go. This is the story of a stand-up comedian called Andy who's just gone through a breakup with his girlfriend of 4 years called Jen. He doesn't really understand why Jen has ended it, but it causes this big upheaval in his life. He has to move home, reconnect with friends who are also all in relationships, and he starts to reevaluate his own life and career. And oh my, the audio for this was spectacular. Arthur Darvill, who I believe was a companion on Doctor Who, is the voice of Andy, and he just does a really terrific job. I think this might be the best narrated audiobook I've ever listened to. I found it all really funny and painfully relatable. As someone in their 30s, I just completely vibed with some of the ruminations on friendship and relationships and coming to terms with that feeling of not being the youngest generation anymore. All of the interactions with his friends, between him and his male friends, not being able to get much deeper than joking things off, was really well done and very believable. Andy has lots of encounters with some pretty ridiculous characters, like this guy who rents him a houseboat, or an old man he lodges with who's a bit of a prepper and conspiracy theorist, and also strangely a Beatles superfan, and a younger woman that he dates for a while. His friend going through her Instagram account and just being completely baffled was hilarious to me. But you forgive the ridiculousness of some of these characters because there was some truth shining through in some of them. They were all amped up a little bit for the sake of the story, but I did believe in each and every one of them. At this point, I'm going to steer into some slightly spoilery territory, which if you listen to the audiobook won't be much of a spoiler, but if you're reading the physical book, I think it might be. I don't think it's too bad, but if you'd rather not know, you can skip to the next chapter in the video. Okay, so the last 10% or so is from Jen's perspective, narrated again excellently by Oscar-nominated actress Vanessa Kirby. This portion of the book gives us an insight into Jen's decisions, which from Andy's perspective seemed pretty baffling until this point. In fact, I found myself a lot of the time throughout the first 90% of the book wondering why they just didn't get back together, because they clearly loved each other. Jen's perspective sheds some light on this, and I'm not going to explain it here, and it's not really a simple explanation anyway. It's not like there was one thing that happened that made her change her mind. Some people have given this slightly negative review, saying that the main character was really annoying and the balance between the perspectives should have been the other way around, and I think I'm inferring from that those reviewers seem to think that this is supposed to be a takedown of Andy, that Alderton builds him up and then all is revealed about him at the end. But for me, that's kind of a profound misreading of the novel. This is a really good story about two people who just confound one another, because what's on the surface isn't their whole being. It's about the fact that what is confusing or infuriating can make sense, but only if you're in their head and you can understand their background and context. Communication is really hard. Andy does some bad stuff, but is ultimately a good person, and the same goes for Jen. As much as we might want them to be together, this is a novel about accepting that sometimes it just doesn't work out. I loved this and it completely surprised me. Definite recommend. Next up is Redhead by the Side of the Road by Anne Tyler. This was my pick for the Read Good Challenge, for which the January prompt was Annuary, which is a book written by an author called Anne. If you want to join the challenge and you don't mind having missed January, then it's not too late. You can find a link to the prompt video and the story graph challenge in the description. This though was my first Anne Tyler, and it definitely will not be my last, I don't think. This is a pretty quiet, straightforward story of a man called Micah, who's a middle-aged guy who lives alone and runs a tech tech repair service called Tech Hermit in a small town. It's not very heavy on plot, but it's really beautifully observed and written. Micah is a character that you just really want to root for. He's a complex person. He's extremely personable and at ease with people, but he's also a little bit of an outcast. He's a uniquely ordered person and an object of amusement and bafflement for his friends and family. He has a very structured routine in his life, vacuuming on a specific day or cleaning the kitchen on another. He does have a girlfriend, but they live apart from each other and a schedule of seeing one another, but he has no plans to live together or take things any further. His life is a little disrupted when the son of an old flame turns up on his doorstep, wondering if Micah is his father. But Micah never slept with that kid's mother, so it is definitely not his child. You might be thinking that this is a story you've heard 1,000 times before, where this overly ordered character has their life turned upside down by something out of their control and they have to come to terms with it and grow as a person. But I don't think it's quite that. It's a much more subtle story. It's a quiet, heartwarming character study about the human condition, about our connections to those around us, and ultimately about loneliness. Tyler is a super accomplished writer, able to achieve so much in so few words. This is a really short book, and I highly enjoyed my first experience of her writing. I'd be really interested to know if there's anyone watching who's a bit of a Tyler aficionado, which book you would recommend turning to next. Do let me know in the comments. The final book I read this month then was Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. This is a rare non-fiction for me, which I read because it's been kind of pumped back into the public consciousness after being adapted into a film by Martin Scorsese. This is a narrative non-fiction set in the 20s and 30s during the Black Gold Rush, when oil was being pumped at record levels out of the ground in Oklahoma, on land thought to be worthless and given to Native American people. But with the discovery of the oil, the underground reservation made the Osage some of the richest people in the world. This made them a target for manipulation and violence, and Grann takes up the story of a number of murders that took place, which somehow felt orchestrated and connected, but the puzzle pieces could not be put together, and so people were not being brought to justice for the deaths. The story centres on the experience of a woman called Molly Reinhardt, an Osage woman married to a white man whose family suffered heavily at the hands of whoever was carrying out the murders. Grann also connects it to the life of Tom White, a white man sent to investigate the murders in the early days of the Bureau of Investigation, what would later become the FBI, and how new policing methods were employed in this case. I found this really fascinating, especially because I didn't know much about this chapter in history. Seeing the manipulation and oppression used against Native American people was appalling, but it was also really interesting to see how some members of the Bureau, including Tom White, were sidelined or hidden away because they didn't really fit the bill of this professional police force that J. Edgar Hoover was trying to build up. I also really liked how Grann brought things right up to the present day, highlighting how this wasn't some contained incident, there's continued injustice, and he did some of his own primary research to uncover how this story might have been a symptom of wider wrongdoing rather than something that happened by one small group of people at one time in history. I actually read this after watching the film, and I would highly recommend not making the mistake I did and doing it the other way around. This book is 100% the better way to experience this story. It maintains so much more tension, it gives you a much wider angled view of what was going on, and overall just has a much better narrative structure. I really enjoyed this, and I may at some point pick up his more recent novel, The Wager. Really good. That's it for this wrap up. Do let me know what you've been reading in the comments, or if you've read any of the books I talked about today and how you felt about them. I will be back very soon with my end of the world reading wrap up, but until next time, toodles.